You should ask her out." Megan Prescott said it loud enough for half the fundraiser to hear, string lights swaying over the Savannah riverfront, laughter dying around them in waves. Adam Reeves froze, sawdust still ghosting the creases of his knuckles. Across the plank walkway, Hannah Prescott turned. Wine glass paused at her lips, waiting to see if he would flinch. A friend dared the single dad to date her CEO's sister, and she meant every word of it. Neither of them expected what came next, a silence long enough to become its own kind of answer. Some dares are just words people forget by morning. Others rearrange a life without asking permission. "Stay with this one. It does not go where you think it will." Hannah said yes before she had time to talk herself out of it. Not because of Adam, because of Megan, standing there grinning like she had just won something, and because 30 faces were watching to see if the Prescott sister who never dated anyone would finally crack. That was the reason Hannah gave herself walking home that night. It held up for about 2 days. The truer reason arrived later, at 2 in the morning, when she couldn't sleep and made herself admit it. She had spent the last 3 years surrounded by men who introduced themselves by their last names and their net worth in the same breath. Adam had stood there with sawdust on his hands and said almost nothing at all, and something about that silence had held her attention longer than an hour of practiced conversation ever did. She did not examine that thought too closely. Adam knew almost nothing about her. Megan had mentioned, once, that her sister ran something downtown, something with an office and a view, the kind of job that ate weekends. He pictured spreadsheets. He pictured a woman who checked her phone under the table. He was wrong about the second part, though it took him 3 dates to notice. Their first evening together was a walk through the historic district, past the old cotton warehouses turned into restaurants, the live oaks dragging their beards of moss across the streetlights. Hannah wore flats instead of heels, which she never did for anything resembling a work function, and told herself that meant nothing. "You built that bench," she said, nodding at a park bench they passed. One Adam had restored the year before for the city. He had not told her that. She had read the small brass plaque bolted to the armrest. "Guilty," he said. "It's good work. It's a bench. It's still good work." She said it like she meant it, and he found himself looking at her a beat too long before looking away, pretending sudden interest in a storefront across the street. He asked what she did. She said, something with numbers and other people's headaches, and left it there, and he did not push, because pushing felt like the kind of thing that would end the evening early, and he was not ready for it to end. He noticed, though, the particular way her shoulders dropped an inch when she said it, like the question itself was a small weight she was glad to set down for an hour. They talked instead about nothing that mattered, and everything that did her favorite ugly building downtown, a dog she'd wanted as a kid and never gotten, a wife he mentioned once, gently, without elaborating, and Hannah did not ask him to. Some things, she understood already, needed to be given rather than taken. At home, Ellie was waiting up past her bedtime, 8 years old, and incapable of pretending otherwise. "Did you kiss her?" she asked, delighted by her own boldness. "Ellie, Dad, we had coffee. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." She giggled and let herself be carried to bed anyway, and fell asleep still smiling about it, and Adam sat on the porch a long time after, turning something over that he did not have a name for yet. It was not just that Hannah was easy to talk to, it was that she listened like she had nowhere else to be, which in his experience was the rarest thing in Savannah, or anywhere else. Hannah, 3 miles away in a house too big for one person, poured a glass of wine she did not finish, and thought about a man who fixed park benches for a living and did not once check his phone. She thought about how long it had been since anyone had made her forget, even for an hour, that she ran a company with 300 employees and a board that watched her like they were still deciding whether her father's judgment had passed to her intact. Neither of them said the word again, date, dare, any of it. They just kept finding reasons to see each other. A second walk became a third. A carpenter and a woman with a corner office and headaches she wouldn't name, circling something neither one of them had agreed to yet, and neither one of them in a hurry to name it, either. The customer came into the workshop on a Tuesday, an older man named Frank Doyle, who had once hired Adam's old firm for a warehouse retrofit outside Atlanta, back before Adam had sawdust for a living instead of blueprints. Frank did not know that history had ended. He clapped Adam on the shoulder, like 6 years had not passed, the bell over the door still swinging behind him. "Reeves, didn't expect to find you fixing furniture. Last I heard you were running load calculations for half of Fulton County." The shop went quiet in that particular way workshops do. The table saw ticking as it cooled, dust motes hanging in the one shaft of afternoon light through the front window. "Different life," Adam said, and meant for that to be the end of it, already reaching for a rag to wipe down his hands. "Shame. What happened over there?" "Waste of a good engineer." Frank shook his head, already moving on to ask about a chair leg he wanted matched to a set from his grandmother's estate. And Adam let him. Grateful the man did not know enough to say more. Grateful, too, that Frank had never learned the details of exactly how that career had ended. Hannah had come by to drop off lunch, an excuse, and they both knew it, and she had heard just enough standing near the door, paper bag still in hand. Engineer, load calculations. A shame. What happened? She did not ask. She wanted to. The question sat right at the back of her teeth the whole time. She watched Frank ramble on about chair legs, but something about the way Adam's jaw had tightened told her this was not a door he wanted opened, over sandwiches. So she let it go, and handed him his lunch, and asked instead about the bench, about anything else, and watched some of the tension drain back out of his shoulders as the conversation moved somewhere safer. Later, after Frank had left with his measurements and his promise to return, Adam caught her studying him across the workbench, and for a moment he almost said something. Then Ellie called from the back room, wanting help finding her shoes, and the moment passed the way most of them did that week: close, and then gone. That night, at Adam's kitchen table while he finished cleaning up after dinner, Ellie told Hannah a story unprompted, the way children do, about her mother, about a woman named Claire, who used to hum while she cooked and always burned the toast on purpose, she said. Because Ellie liked it that way. Liked picking the black crusts off, and eating them first. Like a game only the two of them knew. Hannah had not asked. She just listened. Elbows on the table, and something in her chest went soft and unguarded, in a way she was not prepared for. She drove home past the old cotton warehouses again, slower than she needed to, windows cracked to let in the smell of the river, and thought about a man who used to calculate the loads that kept buildings standing, who now sanded down another family's dining table for a living, who had a daughter who told stories about her mother like they were still warm, still nearby, still worth burning the toast for. Hannah did not know what had happened to him. She only knew that whatever it was, it had cost him something large enough that he still flinched at the memory of it, 5 years on, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday over a chair leg, and for reasons she could not entirely account for, she wanted more than she had wanted almost anything lately to be someone he could eventually tell. Across town, in an office with a river view, Roy Dalton scrolled through a supplier list for the Riverwalk Exchange Rooftop Edition and stopped on a name in the reclaimed lumber contract, Reeves Restoration. He sat with that for a long moment, thumb hovering over the trackpad, then closed the file, and told himself it was a common enough name, common enough that a man in his position had no reason to think twice about it. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon before he left the office that night, which was not something he usually did on a Wednesday. The dates that followed lost their nervousness. They stopped feeling like something either of them had been dared into, and started feeling like something they had chosen, quietly, on their own, one Saturday afternoon at a time. They fixed a park bench together on a Saturday, an actual one this time, a splintered rail down by Forsyth Park that the city had been meaning to get to for a year. Hannah showed up in jeans, which surprised him more than the flats had. She held the board steady while he drilled, and swore when she pinched her thumb, and laughed at herself for swearing, glancing around like someone might have overheard a CEO cursing over a 2x4, and Adam thought, not for the first time, that he liked her best when she forgot to be careful. "You're better at this than you should be," he told her, watching her sand down a rough edge with more precision than the job required. "I like things that have a clear right answer," she said. You'd be amazed how rare that is in my week. They went fishing off the Wilmington River, one gray Sunday, mostly in silence, which neither of them minded. Hannah caught nothing. Adam caught a small redfish he threw back, and she teased him about it the rest of the afternoon. All that skill, and you just let it go, and somewhere in that teasing, he realized he had stopped bracing for the conversation to turn toward jobs and titles and the things people usually needed to know about each other before they let themselves feel anything. Ellie came along on one of those Sundays, delighted to be included, and spent an hour teaching Hannah how to skip stones with a seriousness usually reserved for matters of state. Hannah, it turned out, was terrible at it, and did not mind being terrible at it in front of an 8-year-old, which Adam noticed and filed away as the kind of small thing that told him more than any conversation could have. She never asked what he used to do. He never asked what, exactly, ate up her weekends. It was not avoidance so much as an absence of reason. Nothing about fixing a bench or baiting a hook required either of them to say more than they wanted to. The gap in what they knew about each other sat there, unremarked. The way a locked door in a house you're only visiting doesn't need explaining. Megan noticed the shift before either of them said anything about it. "You two are disgusting," she told Adam over the phone, not unkindly. "In a good way. Don't ruin it by overthinking." "Who says I'm overthinking? You're a single dad who alphabetizes his spice rack. You're always overthinking." He laughed, and did not deny it, and did not tell her that the thing keeping him up some nights had nothing to do with spices and everything to do with how much he wanted to tell Hannah, things he had promised himself he would never talk about again, how the wanting had started to feel bigger than the promise. For her part, Hannah started turning down dinners with men whose names came with the right kind of last name attached, men her mother would have approved of, men who talked about their portfolios the way other people talked about the weather, and did not examine too closely why a carpenter with a gap in his sentences had become the person she looked forward to seeing most. The announcement came from Prescott Group on a Thursday morning, splashed across the local paper with a rendering attached. A rooftop event space, glass and steel, crowning the old Riverwalk Exchange building down by the water, grand reopening in 6 weeks. Hannah's name was on the press release, front and center, the first major project she had championed since taking over from her father, the one she had promised the board would prove she belonged in the chair she'd inherited. Adam saw the poster in the window of a coffee shop downtown and stopped walking, coffee going cold in his hand. The Riverwalk Exchange. He knew that building the way a person knows a scar not by looking at it, but by the ache when something brushes against it. He had spent 11 months of his old life inside its bones, calculating what its floors could bear and what they could not, before someone above him decided his math was inconvenient. The poster carried only the Prescott Group name and logo, nothing that told him who ran it now, and the two facts, the building he once tried to save and the woman he was falling for, sat in his mind without touching each other yet. He told himself it was an old wound reopening, nothing more. A coincidence of geography in a city small enough that coincidences like this happened. He did not know yet how right the first half of that thought was, and how wrong the second half would turn out to be. He folded the poster's flyer insert into his jacket pocket anyway. The way a person keeps a thing they aren't ready to look at directly but isn't ready to throw away either. At the Riverwalk Exchange itself, Gary Pruitt walked the basement level with a flashlight and a clipboard, same as he did every month, 61 years old, and 4 years from a pension he had no intention of losing. He found the crack running along the support wall almost by accident, wider than it had been in March, wider than it should have been at all, the flashlight beam catching a shadow that hadn't been there before. Gary crouched and ran his thumb along the seam, feeling loose grit come away under his nail. He had seen a crack like this before, once, a long time ago, on a job site he tried hard not to think about anymore. He had hoped never to see one again. He did not write it up that night. He told himself he wanted to check it again first. Make sure. Be certain. And some part of him, the honest part, the part that had worked construction sites for 30 years, knew that was not really why he hesitated. He had a pension. He had grandchildren in Pooler he helped put through school. He was not eager to be the man who caused trouble on Roy Dalton's rooftop project 6 weeks before opening night, not when he was close enough to retirement to taste it. That evening, Ellie asked her father why he looked sad, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug he had forgotten to drink from, the poster still folded in his jacket pocket, like something he couldn't quite throw away. "Just an old building," Adam said, and pulled her into a hug instead of explaining, and she let it go the way children do, trusting that whatever it was, her father would handle it. Adam did not tell Hannah what he had recognized in that poster. Not yet. He turned it over for 2 days, weighing what saying it out loud might cost him, running the same argument in circles until it wore a groove in him. If he told her the truth that he used to be the engineer on that building, that his name still sat somewhere in a file cabinet next to a report someone had buried, she would ask why he had never mentioned it. She would want to know the rest. And the rest was a story about being pushed out of his own career at the exact moment his wife was sick, a story he had spent 5 years not telling anyone, including himself on his worst nights, the ones where he still woke up running numbers in his head for a job he no longer had. If he said nothing, and the building was fine, no harm done. If he said nothing, and it was not fine, he would never forgive himself for having stayed quiet to protect a few weeks of something good. He sanded the same table leg 3 times over that week without noticing, which Ellie pointed out at dinner, and he laughed it off, and she let him, the way she let a lot of things go that she probably shouldn't have at 8 years old. Hannah felt him pull back before she understood why. He answered slower. He canceled a Wednesday dinner with an excuse that did not quite hold its shape, something about a delivery running late that she was fairly sure he had made up on the spot. She assumed, because it was the assumption closest to hand, that she had somehow become too much for him, too complicated, too much company overhead disguised as a woman he had feelings for. "If you want to stop this," she said one night on his porch, arms crossed against a cold she was inventing to have something to do with her hands, "you can just say so. That's not it." "Then what is it, Adam?" He almost told her right there. He got as far as, "There's something about that building your company's fixing up," before he stopped himself, because he could hear how it would sound like a man using a relationship to angle for information, like exactly the kind of thing that would make her doubt every quiet evening they had spent together up to that point. "Forget it," he said instead. "Long day." She let it go, though it cost her something to, and she drove home that night replaying the sentence he hadn't finished, wondering what building he could possibly mean and why it had put that particular look on his face. She almost turned the car around twice, and both times talked herself out of it, telling herself that whatever it was, he'd tell her when he was ready, and pushing back would only prove she didn't trust him to. That night, instead of calling Hannah again to try to explain what he could not yet explain, Adam sat on his porch with his phone in his hand for a long time, before he finally dialed a name he had not called in 5 years. Gary Pruitt picked up on the 4th ring, and when Adam said his name, there was a long pause before Gary said, quiet and rough, "I wondered when you'd call." That night, in the records room 3 floors below Roy Dalton's office, Gary stood in front of a locked cabinet with a key he was not supposed to still have, hands unsteady under the buzzing fluorescent light, and pulled a folder that had not been touched in 5 years. He photographed every page with his phone before he let himself think too hard about what he was doing, then slid the folder back exactly as he had found it, straightened the label, and locked the cabinet again, like a man erasing his own footprints. Gary met Adam the next evening at the workshop, after Ellie had gone to a friend's house for dinner, and set the folder on the workbench between them like it might still be dangerous, like the paper itself carried some residual charge after 5 years in a locked drawer. "You were right," Gary said. "About the load transfer on the east wall. I found the calculations." "Your calculations. Somebody signed off over your objection 2 weeks after you filed it." Adam turned the pages slowly, his own handwriting in the margins, 5 years younger, careful and certain, a signature at the bottom that was not his, Roy Dalton's. "He knew," Adam said. "He knew, and he buried it, and he made sure you were the one who looked unreasonable for making noise about it. I was project foreman then. I should have said something. I had a mortgage and 2 kids in high school, and I told myself it wasn't my fight." Gary's voice cracked on the last word, and he looked down at his own hands like they belonged to someone he wasn't proud of. "I kept a copy anyway." never could bring myself to throw it out. Told myself it was just habit. Wasn't habit. I think some part of me always knew this day was coming. Adam sat with that, a long moment. The folder heavy in a way that had nothing to do with paper weight. "There's a crack in the east basement wall," Gary said. "Wider than it should be." "Same wall. I found it a week ago and I haven't written it up yet. Because I've spent 30 years not making trouble, and I don't know how to start now. 6 weeks before the ribbon cutting. You have to write it up." "I know, Gary. People are going to be standing on that rooftop." "I know, Adam." Gary looked at him, tired in a way that went past 61 years. "That's why I called you instead of doing it quietly. I needed somebody who'd make me finish this instead of letting me talk myself out of it again." Adam looked down at his own 5-year-old handwriting, at the proof that he had been right and it had cost him everything anyway, and understood, with a kind of grim clarity, that he was not going to get to keep pretending he was just a man who fixed furniture. Not this time. He thought of Hannah, and what this would mean for the two of them, once she knew all of it, not just that he used to be an engineer, but which building, and which report, and whose name was on the falsified sign-off sheet, sitting 3 floors above her own office. There was no version of telling her the truth that did not also hand her a war with her own board. He thought of Ellie asleep at her friend's house, trusting the world to be steadier than it was. Then he folded the report under his arm and drove to Hannah's house, because there was no more room left for waiting. She opened the door, already reading his face. What happened? He held up the folder instead of answering right away, and something about the gesture, formal, careful, like he was handing over evidence rather than starting a conversation, made her step back to let him in without a word. He told her all of it, sitting at her kitchen table, the parts he had never told anyone outside Gary, and his own late-night thoughts. The load calculations, the report he refused to soften, the meeting where a man named Roy Dalton told him his numbers were overly conservative and needed revising before submission, the revision Adam refused to make. The restructuring that eliminated his department 2 weeks later, timed close enough to look accidental and far enough to be deniable. "I used to be an engineer," he said. "On this building." "Your building." Hannah sat very still. "Roy signed off on your report." "Not on my report." "Over it." She reached for the folder and read Roy Dalton's signature herself, 5 years old and perfectly legible, sitting beneath calculations that were not his and a conclusion that contradicted them. Something in her face changed as she understood, in the same breath, 2 things at once: what Adam had lost, and who exactly had taken it from him. A man who sat 2 seats down from her at every board meeting, a man her father had trusted for 20 years. "You knew this whole time," she said, not an accusation so much as a fact she was still absorbing. "Since when?" "Since I saw the poster." "I didn't know it was you running it." "I swear to you, Hannah, I didn't put it together until Gary showed me the file with Roy's name on it, and you were going to tell me eventually. Or, I was trying to figure out how to tell you without it sounding like I'd been using you to get close to your company." I know how that looks. She believed him, mostly because of how badly he clearly did not want this to be true, and mostly because the alternative, a 5-year, patiently executed scheme involving a chance meeting at a fundraiser Megan had orchestrated on a whim, did not survive contact with common sense. But belief did not make the ground under her any steadier. She sat awake most of that night, the folder open on her kitchen table, reading the same page over and over until the words stopped rearranging themselves into something less painful. She called Roy Dalton that same night, and he agreed to meet her at the office at 9 the next morning. And when she laid the folder on his desk, his face did something practiced and smooth, a face built for boardrooms. "That's an old, disputed report," Dalton said. "Reeves was let go over performance issues. Hannah, not some cover-up. I'd be careful whose word you're taking here, given the personal nature of your relationship with him. There's a crack in the east basement wall. Widening. Buildings settle. That's not evidence of anything. It's evidence of exactly the failure mode he predicted 5 years ago." Dalton's jaw tightened, the first honest thing his face had done all morning. "If you go pulling at this thread in front of the board 6 weeks before we open, You will hand every competitor in this city a story about the Prescott name and structural failure in the same sentence. Think very carefully about what you're willing to burn down here, Hannah. Your father built this company. You'd be gambling it on a relationship with a man who lost his last job for exactly this kind of stubbornness. Hannah left his office with her hands shaking, not from fear of him, but from the size of the decision now sitting in front of her. She called an emergency session of the board for that evening and stood at the head of the table with Roy Dalton 3 seats down, watching her with an expression that dared her to blink first. 9 board members sat around the long mahogany table, papers untouched, the river visible through the window behind Hannah's chair, dark now except for the lights of a passing barge. I'm postponing the reopening, Hannah said, until we complete an independent structural review of the east wall. Based on what? One board member asked, an older man named Warren, who had sat on the board since her father's time. A 5-year-old grievance from a disgruntled former contractor, based on a crack our own maintenance team documented last week, Hannah said, and nodded to Gary, who stood at the back of the room in his work uniform, clipboard in hand, more nervous than he had been in 30 years on job sites. Gary walked them through what he had found, plainly, in the flat, unadorned language of a man who had spent his life around concrete and steel and had no patience left for spin. He passed around printed photographs, dated and time-stamped, of the crack running the length of the support wall. A few of the board members leaned forward without meaning to. Then Adam stood, in a shirt that still smelled faintly of sawdust, no matter how many times he'd washed it, and walked the room through calculations 5 years old that had never stopped being correct. This isn't personal history, Adam said, steady, the room's attention settling on him the way it used to in another life. This is a load-bearing wall, carrying more weight than it was ever rated for, with a documented crack that's widening under a rooftop addition nobody re-engineered for the new load. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to get an outside engineer in there this week, before you put 400 people on that roof for a ribbon cutting, Dalton argued. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and told the room this was hysteria dressed up as diligence, that Reeves had a grudge 5 years old and a girlfriend on the board who'd lost her objectivity. Ask yourselves, he said, whether you'd be hearing any of this if Hannah weren't seeing this man socially. Ask yourself, Hannah said, without raising her voice, why your signature is on a report that overrode his numbers without ever running new ones. The room went very quiet. Warren looked down at the photograph in his hands for a long moment, then back up at Dalton, and something in his face had already changed. The board voted 7-2 to postpone the opening and fund emergency reinforcement. 2 votes belonged to Roy Dalton and a friend of his from the finance committee. Everyone else had seen enough. Watching from the back of the room, Hannah understood something about Adam that she had not fully let herself see before, that the man who fixed park benches and let his daughter win at checkers had also, once, stood exactly this straight in exactly this kind of room, and had been right, and had paid for being right with everything he had built. She was not falling for a carpenter who used to be someone else. She had been falling, this whole time, for the same person in both lives. At home, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with Megan, coloring with the television off, glancing at the door every few minutes. Is Dad going to be okay? She asked. Crayon paused mid-stroke, and Megan, who did not entirely know the answer herself, told her that her father was doing something brave, and that being brave usually took a little longer than being scared. Ellie considered that for a moment, then went back to her coloring, apparently satisfied, and Megan sat there wishing she felt half as certain as she'd sounded. The independent engineers confirmed everything within 48 hours. The crack ran the full depth of the east wall, exactly as Adam's old calculations predicted, and the rooftop addition would have added roughly 30% more load than that wall could safely bear. Reinforcement began within the weak steel bracing, new footings, work that would push the reopening back nearly 2 months. A delay the local paper covered as a story about Prescott Group's integrity rather than its failure, which was not the version of events Roy Dalton had been counting on. Roy Dalton was suspended from the board pending an internal investigation the following Monday. his name quietly removed from the city's Historic Preservation Committee soon after, the kind of fall that happens fast once people stop pretending not to notice. He did not call Hannah to argue his case. There was, by then, nothing left to argue. Hannah called an all-staff meeting the day the suspension became public. She stood in front of the same room that had voted, and named Adam Reeves and Gary Pruitt by name, and told 200 employees the truth, that a report filed 5 years ago had been buried to protect a timeline, and that the two men who refused to let that stay buried had likely kept the building from a catastrophic failure. Gary stood near the back, cheeks reddening under the applause, looking like a man unaccustomed to being thanked out loud. Afterward, in the quiet of her office, she and Adam finally talked without anything left unsaid between them, not the careful, circling conversations of two people protecting themselves, but the plain kind, the kind that comes after the hardest part is already behind you. "I should have told you sooner," Adam said. "About all of it. The building, Roy, my old life. I kept telling myself I was protecting you. I think I was mostly protecting myself. I should have asked sooner. I let the not knowing feel safer than it was, because asking meant admitting I already cared enough for the answer to matter. What happens to Gary? He keeps his pension. And I've asked him to take on a new title head of structural safety review for every Prescott property. He earned it about 5 years too late, but I intend to make up the difference." She paused. "What about you? Any interest in consulting? I hear there's an opening. I fix furniture now, Hannah. You fix furniture beautifully. You could also stop pretending that's the only thing you're good at." He looked at her a long moment, weighing something he'd been weighing for 5 years without letting himself name it. "Let me think about it." Slowly. "I've got a daughter who likes having her father home for dinner, and I'm not interested in trading that back for a corner office. Nobody's asking you to. There's room for both. If you want it." She looked at him a long moment too. "For what it's worth, Megan's taking full credit for all of this." Adam almost laughed. "She dared me to ask you out." "She didn't dare me to fall for you." "No," Hannah said. "That part we did on our own." 2 months later, the Riverwalk Exchange reopened on a clear October evening, the reinforced east wall hidden behind new brick, the rooftop crowded with lanterns, and the kind of easy conversation that comes when a city trusts a building again. Gary stood near the entrance in a suit that did not quite fit him, accepting handshakes he clearly had not expected, looking, for once, like a man with nothing left to carry alone. Someone from the local paper asked him how it felt to be called a hero, and he laughed and said he'd settle for being called honest. 20 years too late was still better than never. Ellie ran along the riverfront railing with Megan chasing half a step behind, both of them laughing at something no one else had heard. String lights swaying overhead the way they had the night this whole thing started. Ellie had a new joke about her father's job that she'd been saving all week, something about how he used to build whole buildings, and now he just fixed one chair at a time, and she delivered it to anyone who would listen, delighted with herself. Adam and Hannah stood near the water, not far from where Megan had said the words that started it, watching the crowd without needing to say much of anything. He reached over at some point and took her hand, an ordinary gesture that had taken 5 months and 1 buried report and 1 honest conversation to become possible. "Any regrets?" Hannah asked, watching the lantern sway against the dark water. "About the dare? About any of it." Adam thought about the wife he had lost, the career he had walked away from grieving, the 5 years he had spent building furniture instead of buildings, and telling himself that was enough. He thought about how none of that had actually ended it, had just been waiting, the way the crack in that wall had been waiting, for someone willing to look at it honestly. He had taken the consulting position after all, part-time, enough to keep his hands in both worlds without losing either one. "No," he said, "none of it." Nearby, Megan caught Hannah's eye and mouthed something that looked suspiciously like "told you so." And Hannah rolled her eyes and did not disagree. Ellie ran back over, breathless, and tugged on her father's sleeve until he crouched down to her level. "Can Hannah come to my birthday party?" she asked, like it was the most obvious question in the world. Adam glanced up at Hannah, who was already nodding before he could answer for her. Wouldn't miss it, Hannah said, and Ellie beamed and ran back to Megan, satisfied. The matter apparently settled for good. They had never planned for any of this, not the dare, not the report, not each other. But this time, when the truth finally came out into the open, neither one of them looked for a reason to walk away.